Rome, the 15th of January, year 69. Before dawn, an old man is already awake. Servius Sulpicius Galba is 71 years old, and he has worn the purple for 7 months. Outside the walls, in the barracks of the Praetorian Guard, soldiers are talking in low voices about a payment that was promised and never came. In the forum, a rumor is already moving faster than any messenger. The guard is turning. Galba has not yet been told. The city itself does not know either. Vendors are opening stalls in the forum as if this were an ordinary morning, and for a few more hours, it still is. He calls for his armor, a simple breastplate, and someone in his household warns him it will do little against so many swords. Galba answers only that it will do for an old man. He orders a litter into the forum to face the soldiers directly, the way he has faced armies for 40 years of service to Rome. He has governed provinces, put down a revolt in Africa decades earlier as a young man, and served under 4 different emperors without ever, until now, wearing the purple himself. What happens next in that square will end a reign of 7 months and begin one of 3 months more. To understand why, we go back to a June morning in a different Rome 7 months earlier. On the 9th of June, year 68, the Emperor Nero took his own life outside Rome, having been declared a public enemy by the Senate he had spent 14 years abusing. Nero left no heir, no chosen successor, and no precedent for what came next. Nero's final years had alienated the very governors and generals whose loyalty every emperor depended on. A provincial governor named Vindex had already revolted months earlier in Gaul, and though Vindex himself was defeated in battle, his revolt cracked open the idea that Nero could simply be replaced. For 100 years, the House of Augustus had supplied every emperor of Rome by blood or adoption. That house was now extinct. Into the vacancy stepped Galba, the governor of Hispania, a 70-year-old senator from an old patrician family, backed by legions who had already sworn loyalty to him as a rival claimant while Nero still lived. Galba's actual goal, stated plainly by ancient sources and consistent with everything he did in office, was restoration of the treasury Nero had emptied and of a discipline Nero had abandoned. It was not a foolish goal. Nero's building projects and public gifts had genuinely strained imperial finances, and contemporary sources describe a treasury that could barely cover ordinary military pay. Galba's response, cutting expenditure and demanding the return of Nero's extravagant gifts, was fiscally sound and politically radioactive at the same time. But Galba was governing a city he had barely lived in, backed by a bodyguard he had not yet paid, in a system where, for the first time in living memory, soldiers rather than senators would decide who kept the throne. The clearest test of that new reality was already waiting for him, a payment promised in his name before he ever reached Rome that the Praetorian Guard expected on his accession, as new emperors before him had given. It was not a small sum. A full donative could equal several years of an ordinary soldier's pay. Galba refused to honor it. To understand why that single refusal would matter more than any battle he never fought, we need to understand what the Praetorian Guard had become by the year 69, and why a bodyguard created to protect emperors had turned into the one institution capable of destroying them. The Praetorian Guard was created in 27 BC, under the first emperor Augustus, as a bodyguard of 9 cohorts, roughly 4,500 men in total. Its purpose was narrow: protect the imperial family. Augustus was careful about how visible that protection looked. Only 3 cohorts were stationed inside Rome itself at any time, the rest kept distributed through Italian towns. So the new imperial system would not resemble at a glance a city held under military occupation. Each cohort answered to its own tribune, but overall command sat with 1 or 2 Praetorian prefects, equestrian officers, appointed directly by the emperor rather than senators, a deliberate choice to keep the Guard's loyalty personal rather than institutional. For decades, the arrangement worked exactly as designed. That changed under the Emperor Tiberius. His Praetorian prefect, a man named Sejanus, persuaded Tiberius to consolidate all 9 cohorts into a single fortified camp just outside the city walls, the Castra Praetoria. It was presented as efficiency. What it actually created was concentration. Several thousand armed men garrisoned together permanently within a few minutes' march of the seat of imperial power. Tiberius himself would later come to regret the arrangement once Sejanus used that same concentrated force to build a private power base of his own. But by then, the precedent of a single fortified guard camp could not be undone. Within a century, the guard that Augustus built to protect an emperor's family had become the one force in Rome capable of choosing or unmaking an emperor entirely. Galba was about to find out exactly how literal that was. Galba's refusal of the guard's accession payment was not an oversight. The biographer Suetonius records that Galba openly considered the payment a bribe and refused it on that basis. Soldiers, in his view, should serve Rome out of duty, not be purchased into loyalty to any one man. It was a coherent position for a career senator raised on the old republic's ideals and consistent with decades of how he had always led soldiers. Earlier in his career, as a provincial governor, Galba had a reputation for strict, sometimes harsh discipline over his own troops. It was also, in the year 69, a direct challenge to the only real power base he had. The men who could make him emperor and the men who could kill him were the same men he had just told they would not be paid. Galba compounded the problem in January of 69. Being childless and elderly, he needed an heir, and the assumption in Rome, including inside the guard itself, was that he would name Marcus Salvius Otho, a former governor and one of his own earliest supporters. Instead, Galba adopted Piso Licinianus, a young senator of distinguished but politically unconnected lineage, telling Piso in a speech recorded by the historian Tacitus that adoption let a ruler choose the best person to govern, not merely the person closest to him. It was, again, a defensible principle. Otho, for his part, was no obscure figure passed over unfairly. He had governed the province of Lusitania competently for a decade and had been among the first senators to back Galba's own claim against Nero the year before, a debt Galba's choice of Piso appeared to erase entirely. It was also a public humiliation of a proud, ambitious, and heavily indebted man who had been counting on the throne. Otho did not wait to be humiliated twice. Within days, he had bought the loyalty of a handful of Praetorian officers, still angry over the unpaid donative. And on the 15th of January, the morning we opened with, he moved. Galba, carried into the forum on his litter, met not a crowd he could still address, but soldiers who had already decided the outcome. He and Piso were killed within the hour. Piso, only days into an adoption that had made him heir to the empire, was killed separately near the Temple of Vesta, having tried and failed to find sanctuary there. Both men's heads were cut from their bodies and carried through the city on spears. Galba had reigned 7 months. His actual failure was not age and not weakness. It was a specific misjudgment of what loyalty now cost, made by a man whose entire career had taught him it should never have to be bought at all. While Galba was still adopting Piso in Rome, a second challenge to his rule was already moving, one he seems never to have fully reckoned with. On the 1st of January 69, 2 weeks before Galba's death, the legions stationed along the Rhine frontier in Lower Germany refused to renew their yearly oath of loyalty to him. The next day at Cologne, they acclaimed their own governor, Aulus Vitellius, as emperor instead. Lower Germany's legions had their own grievances, including a winter spent on the frontier with pay in arrears, and a governor who, unlike Galba, had arrived among them freely distributing what funds he had. Vitellius had not sought the position through ambition alone. He had been sent to command the Rhine Legions precisely because Galba considered him harmless, a well-born but unremarkable administrator. The legions decided otherwise on their own initiative before Vitellius fully committed himself to the claim. The men who actually built Vitellius's claim into a war were 2 of his legionary commanders, Aulus Caecina Alienus and Fabius Valens. Both had their own grievances against Galba's administration, and both understood something Galba himself had not fully absorbed: that 4 legions on the Rhine, seasoned by frontier warfare against Germanic tribes, were a more decisive source of imperial power than any acclamation in the Senate House. Fabius Valens in particular had a personal grudge, having been passed over for reward after his own role in suppressing an earlier revolt against Nero. Ambition and genuine political calculation were, as usual in this story, difficult to fully separate. Caecina and Valens split their combined forces into two columns and marched south for Italy, planning to converge on Rome from different directions before any rival could organize a defense against them. Vitellius himself stayed in Germany to gather reinforcements, a caution later writers sometimes read as laziness or hesitation. Judged instead by what he actually knew in January of 69, the calculation was reasonable enough. He commanded a claim built entirely on Rhine Legion loyalty, with no base of support in Rome, no fleet, and no guarantee the Senate would ever ratify what his own soldiers had already decided for him. Let Caecina and Valens fight the war in Italy. He would arrive once the outcome was no longer in doubt. He could not have known that the war his legions started for him would be settled in Italy before he had marched a single mile south himself. Otho, now emperor by the same kind of soldier's acclamation that had made Vitellius a rival claimant, inherited a war he had not started and a treasury no healthier than the one Galba had tried to fix. Suetonius credits him with real efforts at moderation once in office, including honoring debts Nero had left unpaid. None of it mattered if he lost the Rhine Legions war. Otho moved quickly to secure the loyalty of the fleet at Misenum and the legions in Illyria and Moesia, provinces Galba had never fully consolidated behind him, giving Otho, on paper, more total military support than Vitellius could immediately match. He moved north to meet Vitellius's advancing columns before they could fully combine, gathering what forces Rome and its nearby provinces could supply on short notice. The armies met on the 14th of April near Bedriacum, a small town in northern Italy, close to Cremona. Otho's newest legion, the 1st Adoptrix, formed only the previous year from Marines with no legion experience, fought Vitellius's veteran 21st Rapax in some of the day's hardest combat and briefly captured the Rapax's Eagle standard before Batavian auxiliary cavalry broke the Adoptrix's flank. Elsewhere on the field, Otho's 13th Legion gave way as well. Otho's forces were not weak. Several legions and strong Praetorian cohorts fought hard through the day, but Vitellius's Rhine veterans, hardened by real frontier campaigning against Germanic tribes, proved the deciding factor wherever the fighting concentrated most heavily. By the Roman historian Cassius Dio's account, it was an enormously costly single day, some 40,000 dead by his count, though ancient casualty figures like this one are frequently inflated and should be read as an order of magnitude, not an exact ledger. News of the defeat reached Otho at Brixellum, where he had remained during the battle. He still had real options. Reinforcements from the Balkan provinces were on the march, and part of his army wanted to keep fighting. His advisors, and even some of his own guard, reportedly begged him to continue, pointing to the reinforcements already on the road, and an outcome still genuinely undecided. Otho chose not to. That choice, and what it says about him, is where this part of the story has to end. According to the Greek biographer Plutarch, writing within living memory of people who had known men present that day, Otho told those around him it was more just for one man to die for everyone than for many men to die for one. He spent his final hours calmly, put his affairs in order, burned letters that might have endangered anyone who had written to him against Vitellius, and took his own life on the 16th of April, one day after the battle. He had reigned 95 days. Even Vitellius, his victorious rival, is said to have been struck by the manner of Otho's death when he later viewed the sight. It is worth holding two accounts of this man side by side rather than choosing between them. Tacitus elsewhere calls Otho and Vitellius among the least worthy men ever to hold power in Rome. Plutarch describes something closer to a considered, self-sacrificing decision. Both are real primary sources. Neither cancels the other. So measure the two men who opened this year of crisis against what they actually set out to do. Galba's goal was restoration of the treasury and of a discipline he believed Rome had lost. He achieved none of it, not because he was too old to rule, but because he misjudged, badly and specifically, what loyalty now required in a system his own predecessors had quietly changed. Otho's goal, once the war was already forced on him, narrowed to something smaller and in its way more honest. End it before it cost more than it already had. He achieved exactly that, at the cost of his own life, 95 days into a reign he may never have wanted this badly to keep. Rome had one war left to fight before the year was done. That war belonged to Vitellius, and to a rival he had not yet even heard of.